We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a real pleasure to welcome back to the program Professor Eddie Glaude. He is the professor of religion and chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, author of a book I cannot recommend more highly, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. Professor, welcome to the program.
Sam, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you so much for the support.
I know that you're aware of how much I enjoyed reading this book, and my only regret is I have not had an opportunity to read it again before we talk. But I know that I will soon. It's just an amazing, I think, sort of essay in many respects of where we are now on a topic that I think is very, in some ways, difficult to wrap our arms around. And I think you've done a great job at explaining some things and also sort of causing. I mean, one doesn't just read your book; they experience it in some respects, and that is really important, I think. Let's start with this notion of a value gap, as you call it, and this is in the backdrop, or I guess with the backdrop of what you call a Black Depression.
Right. So, part of what motivated me to write the book was all of this talk about economic recovery, that we had turned the corner economically. And when I looked at Black communities across the United States, and particularly those, some of the folks in my own family, I saw really continued hardship, and in some cases communities that were in ruins. And when you look at most of the data, the majority of the data, what you see is just devastation. That Black America is still in some significant way, Sam, languishing under the weight, the burden of the devastation of 2008. Over 240,000 homes lost. White wealth, the wealth gap is now white wealth is 13 times that of Black wealth, so it's grown at its largest level. We see child poverty. 38% of African American children are in poverty. That's since we've been keeping that data, Sam. That's for the first time in America's history, since we've been keeping that data, there are more poor black children than there are poor white children. And what makes that data so startling is that there are 3 times as many white children as there are Black children. And so even when we talk about unemployment numbers, folks talk about what happened in the recent, in December. We know that had a lot to do with the holiday hiring. Macy's has already hinted that it's going to, lay off 4,800 folks. Walmart is doing what it's doing. But what you see now is that we're at current figures. Our current figures now range between 9.4 and 9.8%, depending upon who you're talking, what demographic you're talking about within the community. And when we think about the Great Recession, at the height of the Great Recession, people were in crisis mode when the country at large was at 9-point-something%. Right, so it's just crisis all around. So what I wanted to do is to say, how do you square what we're seeing on the ground with all of this talk of recovery? And one of the ways to square it is to reach for the value gap. And the value gap is really very basic. It is the belief that white people matter more in this country. And to the extent that's true, then the devastation that has happened because of the housing crisis, the jobs crisis, the increase in poverty, all of that will shall we say, happen without any national cries for a response. So the value gap sits at the heart of this country, and it has always sat at the heart of this country, and it distorts democracy at its core.
And so this is the value gap is basically a concept that we all sort of walk around with. Is that, I mean,
right.
And I mean, I want to go back and talk about, and I guess we can talk about that in the context of MLK in terms of sort of like, the American ideal and that concept of whether or not we're not measuring up to an American ideal, or somehow embedded within that American ideal, there's something that's fundamentally problematic. But when for me, what sort of made, which sort of a very good, I think, sort of illustration of the value gap is when you talk about when you were young and you had moved from one side of a town to another.
Right.
And in Moss Point, I guess it was.
Yeah.
And you talk about the value gap as manifested in just the physicality around us, like in these sort of built spaces.
Right, because it is the belief that white people are valued more than others, but that belief is animated it is evidenced in our social arrangements, our political arrangements, and our economic realities. It's not just it's not folk intentionally walking around doing these things. And I give the example, as you rightly note, in the book of when my dad was the second African American hired at the post office in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And Pascagoula is the hometown of former Senator Trent Lott. And I like to say this, I love saying this, Sam, it's also the place where William Faulkner honeymooned. And so when my dad was hired, he decided to move us from one side of town to the other. He knew he had some precocious kids. And so we moved to this nice middle-class neighborhood on a hill. And as we were moving in, I was playing with my Tonka truck outside. And all of a sudden I heard the kid that I was playing with, I heard his father say, "Stop playing with that nigger." And it was the first time I had been called that word. And so I looked at the kid, and then I took my truck and ran inside and told my dad. And typically when we tell the story of American racism, we tell the story in that way. Some mean adult harms a child, or you hear some ugly language or epithet hurled at someone, or some intentional act of prejudice, right? But what's interesting is that I knew at the age of 8, Sam, that we were moving from the black side of town to the white side of town. Because our old neighborhood used to flood every time it rained because we had bad sewage pipes. The sidewalks weren't paved. I fashioned myself a baseball player even when I was 8. Our baseball diamond, the grass wasn't cut as much. The houses weren't as good. The schools weren't as good. So the built environment told me that I was somehow less valued. And so getting called the N-word was just the icing on the cake. So we experienced the value gap in our socials, in our lived environments, in our workplaces, in the schools we attend, and we acquire those habits that then reproduce, right, the belief that some people in this country are less valued than others.
And you also talk about the idea of environmental racism there, and I think it's impossible. I mean, I want you to tell that example that you write about in the book, but it's impossible to contemplate this without thinking about what's going on in Flint.
Because, absolutely.
I mean, that is. But I mean, tell us. I mean, I think people have a sense of this, but I mean, it's. You see it in the context of the baseball field's just not as well manicured, and you see it in the context of, you know what, we're going to cut some corners and it's going to fall on the backs of these people, and you just don't get good water. That's basically it, right?
I mean, and think about it, Sam. 8,000 children in Flint with a population, I think 67% black. 8,000 children. That's all the children in the city.
Under the age of 6, is my understanding. Yep.
Under the age of 6 have been poisoned, right? Have been poisoned with lead. And what that is a result of a belief that certain populations are disposable, right? And we know that there's a certain kind of economic philosophy, particularly under these neoliberal conditions, that presume that there are certain people who are disposable. And we see this not only in terms of something as dramatic and horrible as the Flint crisis and what that manager did and what he decided to do, but we see it in the way in which resources are distributed. People talk about black neighborhoods or poor neighborhoods, brown, poor, brown, black, brown, or poor neighborhoods generally, and they say they're not well kept, right? People don't take care of their things. Well, they don't really see, well, how often is the trash picked up in that neighborhood, right? What are the resources that are being deployed in that neighborhood, right? Folk think that it's just simply on the shoulders of the people who live in those spaces that those spaces look like they do. Or we can just go back to Hudson City Savings. Just last year, the Justice Department, they just had to settle with the Justice Department because they were redlining. And we're not talking about the 1930s and the 1940s. We're talking about 2015, right, where you had race determining where people lived and how resources would be distributed. So part of what we have to do is just simply face the fact, right, that the way in which our society is organized and has been organized, that the belief that some people, white people, are valued more than others is evidenced right, in our built environment, in our social arrangements, in our political arrangements, and in our economic arrangements. Now, some people will say, and you cut me off if I'm going on too long here, but some people will say, and you hear it all the time, that things haven't changed, right? And sometimes we take them at their word, that what they mean is that 2016 is no different than what it was in 1960 or 1860. Of course that's not true. I teach at Princeton. My dad could not attend Princeton. Something has changed, right? But what hasn't changed is the value gap. What hasn't changed are our racial habits, right? The habits that Thomas Jefferson was kind of alluding to in his notes of Virginia, right, from Virginia, right? He was talking about how slavery inculcated a certain disposition, produced a certain character, right? And if we live in a world where there are disposable people who are stereotyped, who are caricatured, it produces certain habits such that we're okay with their suffering. In fact, under current we can even privatize black misery. Right. We can even privatize black misery and engage in that willful ignorance so that we can protect our innocence.
What do you mean by that? We can privatize black misery?
Well, what I mean by that, privatize black misery, we don't look at structures. We don't look at systems. We don't look at the ways in which the distribution of resources can reproduce unequal outcomes. Instead, what we say is that there's a culture of poverty here, right. That people are, millions of black people are daily making bad decisions that reproduce their conditions, that it's their fault. And that's an old argument, right? That's an old argument. There was a version of it, slaves needed to be slaves because they were incapable of civilization. They needed to be taken care of, right? Or Jim Crow, separation, separate but equal was necessary because we were a childlike race, right? It was our fault, right? Even discourses around the backlash, the more black people demand equality, right? The more we incite racist responses on the part of our white fellow citizens. And today we've seen this ever since the war on poverty. Right, the face of welfare. Martin Gildens makes this known in his wonderful work on welfare. The face of public of kind of welfare programs and the like, up into 1968, had been poor white people in the South. And even Dixiecrats supported the New Deal in this regard because they thought in its initial phases, before it began to open up to black folk, they thought it would benefit, right, poor white people in the South. But at the moment in which, right, these quote unquote entitlement programs became associated with black folk, they became associated with bad government. And so what you get is this assumption that black folk are lazy, we want a handout, that we don't want to work hard, and that our suffering is really a result of our bad choices.
And we should say there's two things. The one, that research shows that even black people have accepted that notion, have adopted that notion in terms of welfare. And we can see an example of this sort of personal morality argument even as recently from President Obama with his Brother's Keeper program, it seems to me.
Oh, absolutely. And then, just remember, I'm a Morehouse guy. I'm a Morehouse man. He goes to Morehouse and gives a speech to Morehouse men about being responsible and not sitting on the couch. I might be conflating his speech with Michelle Obama's speech at Bowie State, right? But, kind of chastising this population. I mean, of all populations, not to chastise, it would be these young men graduating from Morehouse. But, we're also we've heard President Obama talk about, black folks should stop eating cold Popeye's chicken for breakfast and the like. And instead of talking about food deserts, right, he's talking about Popeye's chicken. Right. And so there's a way in which I call it in the book a reverse dog whistle, right? And President Obama has had to engage in it, and some others have engaged in it as well. And that reverse dog whistle is to kind of show it's not about appealing to the racist sentiments and beliefs of white people to trigger them, right? Like code words like busing and the like. But it's rather to offer up criticisms of black people so that you can allay the concerns of white people. And so this notion that black folk are making bad choices, and that is the singular cause of what I describe as the Great Black Depression, or what I describe as the condition of certain communities. It's just disingenuous. Let me say this up front. I'm not trying to deny the discourse of personal responsibility. Black folk are human beings just like everyone else. And to the extent that's true, we have knuckleheads. We got folk who are walking around making bad choices. But it's very difficult to account for the enduring legacy of a dual housing market that has produced residential segregation in this country by saying that black folks are just simply overreaching in terms of their economic abilities. It's very difficult to say that black folk are to believe that black folk are lazy, given the history of a dual labor market in this country that has tracked black folk to particular sectors in the labor market. In other words, if we look at the reality of who we are and what we have been as a country, there is a reason why that ghettos exist. There is a reason why unemployment is always close to double that. Black unemployment is almost always double that of white unemployment. There's a reason why our wealth is so small in relation to white folk. There's a reason, and we just need to name it and be honest.
And we should also say, I mean, it seems to me that, and I just think of Michael and I here have had this, have talked about this in the past as well, but you can have a series of mistakes that bring you to a point in your life, but the reality is that just statistically, and this is, I think, a fairly obvious point to make, that broadly speaking, if I take 100 20-year-old white kids and they've made two big mistakes in their life, and 100 black kids and they've made two big mistakes in their life, those 100 kids will have paid, across those 100 people, far less of a price for those mistakes than those black kids. It may be mitigated because their parents have some type of political ability to get them off of my kid shoplifted, or my kid got busted with drinking, or if these kids got addicted, that the parents have the sort of the resources to get them into a good treatment facility, or if they screwed up at a job, they have the connections and the relationships. I mean, you write about the sort of these networks in terms of white privilege that people aren't even aware of, even if it's like, I know the leadership of the union, and I can get you a job there. I mean, there's so many of those things that I think it's very hard, I think, for people who those benefits are available to be conscious of them, because you're just more conscious of things when they don't exist.
Right. Right, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you look at the social science literature on this, and I talk about this in the book. Nancy DiTomaso at Rutgers talking about social networks, and we know for a fact, Sam, that 75% of white social networks are entirely white, right? Are entirely white, and those social networks are animated by a similarity of belief. So if you hold particular views that black people are lazy, your social networks tend to reflect folk who hold similar views. So they reinforce those positions, right? So they did all of this, like you noted, they did all of these interviews across New Jersey and Tennessee and elsewhere in the country. And, you had these assumptions that black people, these are white interviewers saying black people are lazy, they don't want to work hard for anything. And it turns out that they've naturalized their privilege, right? It's just an example of their hard work and individual merit, when in fact we know that, some father who was a member of the union hooked the person up with the job, or a friend. In one instance, it was so egregious, a friend gave the person not only the test, but the answers to the test. Right. And so I think you're absolutely right. But at the heart of all of this, so we talk about the Great Black Depression in the book, and we talk about the value gap, and we talk about racial habits. Racial habits are more important to me, to my mind, than loud racist, right? That those habits are evidenced in the way we live our lives daily. It's not just bad people who are explicitly racist, it's all of us who are reproducing this hierarchy in our daily choices. And then then the way in which fear, and we see this so much, Sam, and you know this, in the present presidential election, fear motivates so much of how we live our lives in this country and reproduces in so many different ways the value gap. You got white fear doing all sorts of political work, whether it's moral panics around black criminality that led to mass incarceration, whether it's worries about black revenge and black anger and black hatred, or even on the part of black people. I say this in the book, right? We're so afraid of triggering white fear that we won't tell the truth. We're so afraid that we're going to trigger white racism that we're constantly masking. We're masking in the workplace. We're masking in the political sphere, right? In some places, the only place where we're comfortable is in the barbershop and at home, you know? And as long as that's the case, then there's an illusion, there's a lie that's at the heart of our public life, right? And it just keeps bubbling up.
Give people an example of what you mean by you're masking at work, and where there's that fear. I mean, I know you write in the book that you've experienced that white fear of driving in a part of town maybe that you're not familiar with. But talk about that idea of the experience of masking at work. Is it just a matter of, I'm not going to say to that guy who sits at the other table or the desk next to me, like, hey, dude, that's inappropriate, because you don't know where that ends at work.
Right. So that there's that obvious example, but I forget the author of the book, but he wrote a wonderful book entitled Monkey Suit, talking about black people in major law firms across the country. And not only, we from our style of dress to our style of our style of our hairstyles, our style of speech, there's a constant way in which we're navigating these spaces so that we can become blank. Right, so that our cultural and racial difference doesn't stand out. You see, so you can find yourself not quite speaking as comfortably as you would, and people do this all the time. But it carries whether you're white or black, right? It carries you adjust to the demands of the workspace. But for black folk, many black folk and many brown folk, it carries the burden. Right, it carries the burden of this kind of racial reality, right? So you find yourself navigating space, listening to that off-color joke when you really want to cuss somebody out, right? Not putting on that particular tie because you don't want to stand out, right? Getting a certain kind of haircut. You're going to not wear your dreads. You're not going to really lock up. Grow dreads because you don't want to be seen as unclean and unkempt. So you're always doing that. You're always doing that, right? Or you can't be angry, right? You can't get angry, right? So the fact that I say in the book that it's exhausting. I can sit there and listen to Bill O'Reilly or listen to Rush Limbaugh, or even in some moments listen to Barack Obama, and you just want to cuss, you just want to shout the F word, but you can't because you don't want to be perceived as this angry black man, right? Because as soon as you're perceived that way, what do? You trigger fears, and then you have to navigate that. Right, so and people talk about this, and there's social science data, Sam, around what does it mean to navigate this sort of thing. It has an impact on women's health, men's health, black women's health, and black men's health. It has an impact on pregnancies, right? That we're constantly navigating the stress, right, of managing how our blackness is perceived.
And I would imagine there's also there's a sort of an ongoing sort of struggle to determine which part, at which point is it what you're experiencing a function of being black in a white environment versus this is the way it goes. I mean, there's that Chappelle sketch where Chappelle snaps when the guy says, give me some skin, or slap me five, or something like that, where Chappelle reacts to, like, you're saying that because I'm black, and on some level, like, we don't know if he's saying that if he's black, and that's got to be an ongoing sort of another element of determining, just like, a reality check of like getting like, what is the reality of this situation? And I don't know that anybody ever knows at any given point.
Right. I mean, there's one in the Whiteness Project, which is this interesting research effort done in and around Buffalo. There's one respondent who says, you can't even talk about fried chicken or Kool-Aid, right? You don't really know where the line is, right? And it was innocent in the way in which she said it, but it was fraught, right? And it reflects in some ways, Sam, that there are few truly integrated spaces in this country. Few. I did a radio show not too long ago where a young man he wasn't a young man, he grew up in South Alabama, right down the street from me. And he talked about being a child of busing and how he was bused from one side of town to the other, and it was almost as if he went into a completely different world. He had no idea that it existed. And we think about that in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, but the same holds true today. You have whole worlds, entire social worlds, entire economic realities that are completely unknown to large segments of American society. And I call some of them are opportunity deserts. They're places where dreams die or they struggle to be born. And then we expect, given how separate our worlds are, for us to navigate each other with more than a bit of skepticism, right? More than a bit of suspicion, and that seems to me naive at best, right? So part of what I try to do in the first part of the book is to describe this challenge that is really deeply rooted in our refusal to honestly confront who we are as Americans. And we often refuse to confront that, Sam, because we actually believe that we're the shining city on the hill, that we actually believe that the only problem there is the gap between our practices and our ideals, as opposed to understanding what Dr. King actually said. And Dr. King said racism is a congenital disease of America. That's a very different claim than there's a difference between our practices and our ideals. There's something baked into how we've been doing this thing.